Section 87 of Reviews by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsten Ferreri. Reviews by Oscar Wilde, edited by Robert Ross. Section 87. Some Literary Notes. 4. Woman's World, April 1889. "In modern life," said Matthew Arnold once, "you cannot well enter a monastery, but you can enter the Wordsworth Society." I fear that this will sound to many a somewhat uninviting description of this admirable and useful body, whose papers and productions have been recently published by Professor Knight under the title of Wordsworthiana. Plain living and high thinking are not popular ideals. Most people prefer to live in luxury, and to think with the majority. However, there is really nothing in the essays and addresses of the Wordsworth Society that need cause the public any unnecessary alarm, and it is gratifying to note that, although the Society is still in the first blush of enthusiasm, it has not yet insisted upon our admiring Wordsworth's inferior work. It praises what is worthy of praise, reverences what should be reverenced, and explains what does not require explanation. One paper is quite delightful. It is from the pen of Mr. Rawnsley, and deals with such reminiscences of Wordsworth as still linger among the peasantry of Westmoreland. Mr. Rawnsley grew up, he tells us, in the immediate vicinity of the present Poet Laureate's old home in Lincolnshire, and had been struck with the swiftness with which, as year by year the labourer tills his wonted glebe, or lops the glades, the memories of the poet of the Somersby wold had faded from off the circle of the hills, had indeed been astonished to note how little real interest was taken in him or his fame, and how seldom his works were met with in the houses of the rich or poor in the very neighbourhood. Accordingly, when he came to reside in the Lake Country, he endeavoured to find out what of Wordsworth's memory among the men of the Dales still lingered on, how far he was still a moving presence among them, how far his works had made their way into the cottages and farmhouses of the valleys. He also tried to discover how far the race of Westmoreland and Cumberland farm folk, the Matthews and Michaels of the poet as described by him, were real or fancy pictures, or how far the characters of the Dalesmen had been altered in any remarkable manner by tourist influences during the 32 years that have passed since the Lake poet was laid to rest. With regard to the latter point, it will be remembered that Mr. Ruskin, writing in 1876, said that, quote, "the border peasantry, painted with absolute fidelity by Scott and Wordsworth," end quote, are as hitherto a scarcely injured race, that in his fields at Coniston he had men who might have fought with Henry V. at Agincourt without being distinguished from any of his knights, that he could take his tradesman's word for £1,000, and need never latch his garden gate, and that he did not fear molestation in wood or on moor for his girl guests. Mr. Rawnsley, however, found that a certain beauty had vanished which the simple retirement of old valley days 50 years ago gave to the men among whom Wordsworth lived. The strangers, he says, with their gifts of gold, their vulgarity, and their requirements, have much to answer for. As for their impressions of Wordsworth, to understand them one must understand the vernacular of the Lake District. "What was Mr. Wordsworth like in personal appearance?" said Mr. Rawnsley once to an old retainer, who still lives not far off from Rydal Mount. "He was an ugly-faced man, and a mean liver," was the answer. But all that was really meant was that he was a man of marked features, and led a very simple life in matters of his food and raiment. Another old man, who believed that Wordsworth, quote, "got most of his poetry out of Hartley," spoke of the poet's wife as "a very unpleasant woman, very unpleasant indeed, a close-fisted woman, that's what she was." This seems, however, to have been merely a tribute to Mrs. Wordsworth's admirable housekeeping abilities. The first person interviewed by Mr. Rawnsley was an old lady who had once been in service at Rydal Mount, and was in 1870 a lodging-house keeper at Grasmere. She was not a very imaginative person, as may be gathered from the following anecdote. Mr. Rawnsley's sister came in from a late evening walk, and said, "Oh, Mrs. D., have you seen the wonderful sunset?" The good lady turned sharply round, and, drawing herself to her full height, as if mortally offended, answered, "No, miss, I'm a tidy cook, I know, and they say a decentish body for a landlady, but I don't know nothing about sunsets or them sorts of things. They've never been in my line." Her reminiscence of Wordsworth was as worthy of tradition as it was explanatory, from her point of view, of the method in which Wordsworth composed, and was helped in his labours by his enthusiastic sister. "Well, you know," she said, Mr. Wordsworth went humming and booing about, and she, Miss Dorothy, kept close behind him, and she picked up the bits as he let 'em fall, and took 'em down, and put 'em together on paper for him, and you may be very well sure as how she didn't understand nor make sense out of 'em, and I doubt that he didn't know much about them either himself, but, however, there's a great many folk as do, I dare say. Of Wordsworth's habit of talking to himself and composing aloud we hear a great deal. Was Mr. Wordsworth a sociable man? Asked Mr. Rawnsley of a Rydal farmer. Wordsworth, for he had no pride nor nowt, was the answer, was a man was quite one to hisself, ye know. He was not a man as folks could crack with, nor a man as could crack with folks. But there was another thing as kept folk off. He had a turble girt deep voice, and you might see his face again for long enough. I've known folks, village lads and lasses, coming over by old road above, which runs from Grasmere to Rydal, flait almost to death by their wishing gad to hear the girt voice a groaning and muttering and thundering of a still evening. And he had a way of standing quite still by the rock there in the path under Rydal, and folks could hear sounds like a wild beast coming from the rocks, and childer were scared fit to be dead almost. Wordsworth's description of himself constantly recurs to one, quote, and who is he with modest looks, and clad in sober russet gown? He murmurs by the running brooks, a music sweeter than their own. He is retired as noontide dew, or fountain in a noonday grove. End quote. But the corroboration comes in strange guise. Mr. Rawnsley asked one of the dalesmen about Wordsworth's dress and habits. This was the reply. Wordsworth wore a jem crow, never seed him in a boxer in my life. A jem crow and an old blue cloak was his rig, and as for his habits, he had none. Never knew him with a pot in his hand or a pipe in his mouth. But he was a great skater for all that. None better in these parts. Why, he could have cut his own name upon the ice, could Mr. Wordsworth. Skating seems to have been Wordsworth's one form of amusement. He was over feckless in his hands, could not drive nor ride, not a bit of fish in him, and naught of a mountaineer. But he could skate. The rapture of the time when, as a boy on Esthwaite's frozen lake, he had, quote, wheeled about, proud and exulting like an untired horse that cares not for his home, and, shod with steel, had hissed along the polished ice, was continued, Mr. Rawnsley tells us, into manhood's later day, and Mr. Rawnsley found many proofs that the skill the poet had gained when, quote, not seldom from the uproar he retired into a silent bay, or sportively glanced sideway, leaving the tumultuous throng to cut across the reflex of a star, was of such a kind as to astonish the natives among whom he dwelt. The recollection of a fall he once had, when his skate caught on a stone, still lingers in the district. A boy had been sent to sweep the snow from the white moss tarn for him. Did Mr. Wordsworth give you out? He was asked when he returned from his labour. No, but I seed him tumble, though, was the answer. He was a terrible gert skater, was Wordsworth now, says one of Mr. Rawnsley's informants. He would put one hand to his breast, he wore a frill shirt in them days, and t'other hand in his waistband, same as shepherds does to keep their hands warm, and he would stand up straight and sway and swing away grandly. Of his poetry they did not think much, and whatever was good in it they ascribed to his wife, his sister, and Hartley Coleridge. He wrote poetry, they said, because he couldn't help it, because it was his hobby, for sheer love and not for money. They could not understand his doing work for nowt, and held his occupation in somewhat light esteem because it did not bring in a deal of brass to the pocket. Did you ever read his poetry, or see any books about in the farmhouses? Asked Mr. Rawnsley. The answer was curious. Aye, time or two. But you're well aware there's poetry and poetry. There's poetry with a little bit pleasant in it, and poetry such as a man can laugh at or the childer understand, and some as takes a deal of mastery to make out what's said, and a deal of Wordsworth was of this sort, you know. You could tell fra the man's face his poetry would never have no laugh in it. His poetry was quite different work from little Hartley. Hartley'd go running along beside the brooks and mak his, and go in the first open door and write what he'd got upon paper. But Wordsworth poetry was real hard stuff, and bided a deal of making, and he'd keep it in his head for long enough. Ah, but it's queer, mon, different ways folks has of making poetry now. Not but what Mr. Wordsworth didn't sound very high, and was a well-spoken man enough. The best criticism on Wordsworth that Mr. Rawnsley heard was this: he was an open-air man, and a great critic of trees. There are many useful and well-written essays in Professor Knight's volume, but Mr. Rawnsley's is far the most interesting of all. It gives us a graphic picture of the poet as he appeared in outward semblance and matter to those about whom he wrote. Mary Miles is Mrs. Edmonds's first attempt at writing fiction. Mrs. Edmonds is well known as an authority on modern Greek literature, and her style has often a very pleasant literary flavour, though in her dialogues she has not quite grasped the difference between la langue parlée and la langue écrite. Her heroine is a sort of Nausicaa from Girton, who develops into the Pallas Athena of a provincial school. She has her love romance, like her Homeric prototype, and her Odysseus returns to her at the close of the book. It is a nice story. Lady Dilke's Art in the Modern State is a book that cannot fail to interest deeply everyone who cares either for art or for history. The modern state which gives its title to the book is that political and social organization of our day that comes to us from the France of Richelieu and Colbert, and is the direct outcome of the Grand Siècle, the true greatness of which century, as Lady Dilke points out, consists not in its vain wars and formal stage and stilted eloquence and pompous palaces, but in the formation and working out of the political and social system of which these things were the first fruits. To the question that naturally rises on one's lips, how can one dwell on the art of the 17th century it has no charm, Lady Dilke answers that this art presents in its organization, from the point of view of social polity, problems of the highest intellectual interest. Throughout all its phases, to quote her own words, the life of France wears, during the 17th century, a political aspect. The explanation of all changes in the social system, in letters, in the arts, in fashions even, has to be sought in the necessities of the political position, and the seeming caprices of taste take their rise from the same causes which went to determine the making of a treaty or the promulgation of an edict. This seems all the stranger because, in times preceding, letters and the arts at least appeared to flourish in conditions as far removed from the action of statecraft as if they had been a growth of fairyland. In the Middle Ages they were devoted to a virgin image of virtue. They framed in the shade of the sanctuary an ideal shining with the beauty born of self-renunciation, of resignation to self-enforced conditions of moral and physical suffering. By the queenly Venus of the Renaissance they were consecrated to the joys of life, and the world saw that, through their perfect use, men might renew their strength, and behold virtue and beauty with clear eyes. It was, however, reserved for the rulers of France in the 17th century fully to realize the political function of letters and the arts in the modern state, and their immense importance in connection with the prosperity of a commercial nation." The whole subject is certainly extremely fascinating. The Renaissance had for its object the development of great personalities, the perfect freedom of the temperament in matters of art, the perfect freedom of the intellect in intellectual matters, the full development of the individual were the things it aimed at. As we study its history, we find it full of great anarchies. It solved no political or social problems. It did not seek to solve them. The idea of the Grand Siècle and of Richelieu, in whom the forces of that great age were incarnate, was different. The ideas of citizenship, of the building up of a great nation, of the centralization of forces, of collective action, of ethnic unity of purpose, came before the world. It was inevitable that they should have done so, and Lady Dilke, with her keen historic sense and her wonderful power of grouping facts, has told us the story of their struggle and their victory. Her book is from every point of view a most remarkable work. Her style is almost French in its clearness, its sobriety, its fine and at times ascetic simplicity. The whole ground plan and intellectual conception is admirable. It is of course easy to see how much art lost by having a new mission forced upon her. The creation of a formal tradition upon classical lines is never without its danger, and it is sad to find the provincial towns of France, once so varied and individual in artistic expression, writing to Paris for designs and advice. And yet, through Colbert's great centralizing scheme of state supervision and state aid, France was the one country in Europe, and has remained the one country in Europe, where the arts are not divorced from industry. The Academy of Painting and Sculpture and the School of Architecture were not, to quote Lady Dilke's words, called into being in order that royal palaces should be raised surpassing all others in magnificence. Bievrebache and the Savonnerie were not established only that such palaces should be furnished more sumptuously than those of an Eastern fairy tale. Colbert did not care chiefly to inquire, when organizing art administration, what were the institutions best fitted to foster the proper interests of art. He asked, in the first place, what would most contribute to swell the national importance. Even so, in surrounding the king with the treasures of luxury, his object was twofold. Their possession should indeed illustrate the crown, but it should also be a unique source of advantage to the people. Glass workers were brought from Venice, and lace makers from Flanders, that they might yield to France the secrets of their skill. Palaces and public buildings were to afford commissions for French artists, and a means of technical and artistic education for all those employed upon them. The royal collections were but a further instrument in educating the taste and increasing the knowledge of the working classes. The costly factories of the Savonnerie and the Gobelins were practical schools, in which every detail of every branch of all those industries which contribute to the furnishing and decoration of houses were brought to perfection, whilst a band of chosen apprentices were trained in the adjoining schools. To Colbert is due the honour of having foreseen not only that the interests of the modern state were inseparably bound up with those of industry, but also that the interests of industry could not, without prejudice, be divorced from art." Mr. Bret Harte has never written anything finer than Cressy. It is one of his most brilliant and masterly productions, and will take rank with the best of his California stories. Hawthorne recreated for us the America of the past with the incomparable grace of a very perfect artist, but Mr. Bret Harte's emphasized modernity has, in its own sphere, won equal or almost equal triumphs. Wit, pathos, humor, realism, exaggeration, and romance are, in this marvelous story, all blended together, and out of the very clash and chaos of these things comes life itself. And what a curious life it is, half civilized and half barbarous, naive and corrupt, chivalrous and commonplace, real and improbable. Cressy herself is the most tantalizing of heroines. She is always eluding one's grasp. It is difficult to say whether she sacrifices herself on the altar of romance, or is merely a girl with an extraordinary sense of humour. She is intangible, and the more we know of her the more incomprehensible she becomes. It is pleasant to come across a heroine who is not identified with any great cause, and represents no important principle, but is simply a wonderful nymph from American backwoods, who has in her something of Artemis, and not a little of Aphrodite. It is always a pleasure to come across an American poet who is not national, and who tries to give expression to the literature that he loves rather than to the land in which he lives. The Muses care so little for geography. Mr. Richard Day's poems have nothing distinctively American about them. Here and there in his verse one comes across a flower that does not bloom in our meadows, a bird to which our woodlands have never listened. But the spirit that animates the verse is simple and human, and there is hardly a poem in the volume that English lips might not have uttered. Sounds of the Temple has much in it that is interesting in metre as well as in matter. Quote, "Then sighed a poet from his soul, the clouds are blown across the stars, and chill have grown my lattice bars. I cannot keep my vigil whole by the lone candle of my soul. This reed had once devoutest tongue, and sang as if to its small throat God listened for a perfect note. As charily this lyre was strung, God's praise is slow and has no tongue." End quote. But the best poem is undoubtedly Hymn to the Mountain. Within the hollow of thy hand, this wooded dell, half up the height, where streams take breath midway of flight, here let me stand. Here warbles not a lowland bird, here are no babbling tongues of men, thy rivers rustling through the glen alone are heard. Above no pinion cleaves its way, save when the eagle's wing, as now, with sweep imperial shades thy brow beetling and grey. What thoughts are thine, majestic peak, and moods that were not born to chime with poets' ineffectual rhyme and numbers weak? The green earth spreads thy gaze before, and the unfailing skies are brought within the level of thy thought. There is no more. The stars salute thy rugged crown with syllables of twinkling fire, like choral burst from distant choir their psalm rolls down. And I, within this temple niche, like statues set where prophets talk, catch strains they murmur as they walk, and I am rich. Miss Ella Curtis's A Game of Chance is certainly the best novel that this clever young writer has as yet produced. If it has a fault, it is that it is crowded with too much incident, and often surrenders the study of character to the development of plot. Indeed, it has many plots, each of which, in more economical hands, would have served as the basis of a complete story. We have as the central incident the career of a clever lady's maid who personifies her mistress, and is welcomed by Sir John Erskine, an English country gentleman, as a widow of his dead son. The real husband of the adventuress tracks his wife to England, and claims her. She pretends that he is insane, and has him removed. Then he tries to murder her, and when she is recovered, she finds her beauty gone and her secret discovered. There is quite enough sensation here to interest even the jaded city man, who is said to have grown quite critical of late on the subject of what really is a thrilling plot. But Miss Curtis is not satisfied. The lady's maid has an extremely handsome brother, who is a wonderful musician and has a divine tenor voice. With him the stately Lady Judith falls wildly in love, and this part of the story is treated with a great deal of subtlety and clever analysis. However, Lady Judith does not marry her rustic Orpheus, so the social convenances are undisturbed. The romance of the rector of the parish, who falls in love with a charming schoolteacher, is a good deal overshadowed by Lady Judith's story, but it is pleasantly told. A more important episode is the marriage between the daughter of the Tory squire and the radical candidate for the borough. They separate on their wedding day, and are not reconciled till the 3rd volume. No one could say that Miss Curtis's book is dull. In fact, her style is very bright and amusing. It is impossible, perhaps, not to be a little bewildered by the amount of characters, and by the crowded incidents. But on the whole, the scheme of the construction is clear, and certainly the decoration is admirable. End of section 87. Some literary notes. 4.